Okay, now we're going to be taking a look at a different type of texture, an object texture, which actually is not seamless at all. And you can use it to replace simple polygons or simple mesh objects within your 3D scenes. And it's very easy to isolate certain textures like this, but there is some distortion and things you have to do to compensate for the photograph that's taken. The first thing I want to do is actually just go ahead and crop out the majority of this texture and pretty much what we're going to be using. So I can grab the crop tool, which is over here on the left of the third one down in the toolbar, and I'm just going to drag that out, and now we can position it pretty much not right up to the edges, but we're going to be using the door frame along with a little bit of this metal strip on the bottom, and then that's pretty much going to be the actual texture. But I want to position our crop just a little bit outside of that area so we have something to work with and make it a little bit easier. But you can see obviously the distortion that is caused not only by the angle that this was taken at, but the lens in itself, and of course the actual door itself being maybe a little bit off. And you just push enter to finish off that crop tool. I'm just going to zoom in here, and what we should take a look at is compensating for that distortion. And we can see a little bit of the lens distortion where it's bending. This is actually, it would be a straight strip, but it is bent a little bit on the sides because it was taken with more of a wide angle lens. And the more zoom you have, of course, it's going to remove that, but you can always get photographs like that. It's knowing how to work with what you have. We can obviously see some coloration issues as well, where we have a very blue tint on the bottom and a very reddish orange tint on the top, and we can correct that very easily. First is position our actual texture. We're going to grab our selection tool, our rectangular selection tool, and I just want to first double click on our layer. Right now it's set to background and is a locked layer, which means if we go to free transform it, we can't because it's locked. So we have to double click on it, and that's going to ask us to create a new layer. Default name layer 0 is fine. We're not going to be really creating any other layers, so that's fine the way that is, and we can just click OK. And now what we want to do is just distort our texture. And if we need to, we can of course use lens correction. But in a case like this, we're really not going to need it because it's not that big of an effect, and we can always fix it with the transformation tools. So I'm going to right mouse click, go to free transform, and the first thing I'm going to use is distort. With distort, we'll be able to pull our edges out and make it match up as best we can. So I'm just going to pull out these edges, and we can watch our preview. And we just want to position that, and we're having a little bit of a display error. It's just a little bit of lagging here. You can see it's matching up, and what we pretty much just want is the door frame up to the edges. And I can just bring this left side down now, and we just kind of want to match up, and so that it's straight all the way around, and we kind of remove some of that distortion as best we can just by using the free transformation tool. And I'm going to pull that side out just a little bit too. And I'm also working with a rather large texture here. This is taken with a 8 megapixel camera. So depending on the speed of your computer, and right now just because the recording is causing it to lag just a little, I might just go ahead and reduce down this texture because it doesn't need to be as large for this. I can go ahead and hit enter, and we can take a look at our transformation and see that we're pretty much overall straightened out with our edges and everything like that. But I'm going to go ahead and zoom in all the way on this so we can see the size of this texture, because it is actually quite a large photo. I'm going to go ahead and just scale this down for tutorial purposes so that it moves just a little bit faster, since the fact that I'm recording a rather large screen. So what we would do is just change our image size and percentage down to 33%. And actually, that didn't change it. So resample. And this will size it down considerably so that we'll be able to work with it just a little bit easier. So now at 100% we're pretty much full screen. And we could even go back and free transform once again to sort of fix those areas if we need to. We could also fix that bowing effect that you see. But before we do that, what we want to do is crop out what we don't need anymore. Because if you, as you just saw when I did free transform again, we still have the original edges of this image in the scene in our file. So we want to get rid of that, and we want to crop that out. So all we really have to do is select our crop tool, and we want to start it out clicking in the gray area, which will automatically start us out in the corner, and then drag it all the way down to the bottom right into that gray area and let go. Hit enter, and now we'll only be working with what we see. So when I go to free transform, you can see it frames out perfectly. Now if we want to fix sort of that bowing effect we have in there, we can use the warp tool, which is good. So if we have even just a subtle effect that we need in there, you can see down here there might be just that little bit of distortion, and we are bringing it in maybe a little farther than we need to. And you can also see some of that transparency starting to come in, which isn't a problem because we could always just crop that in just a little bit further if we needed to. And we still have just a little bit of distortion. It's not too bad. You can just correct that as much as you want to. I'm going to match up the door frame so it's equal width on both sides, or at least close to it. Hit enter. And now we pretty much have that set up. We can go back in our history too and sort of take a look at the differences. Of course, we have our image size, so we can't really see that too much, but we can take a look and compare how it looked before and how it looks now with different distortion that's caused by our camera and how we fix that. But one thing we want to take a look at now is, of course, removing this blue and, of course, the reddish. And this is mostly caused by the reflection of concrete, sort of a, I guess you'd say, a natural radiosity effect. But before I do that, I'm going to adjust our levels. So Control L, and just brighten up the image just a little. And one advantage too, when if you're actually the one taking the photographs, or if you can give suggestions to whoever's taking the photographs for you, if you're not doing them yourself, the best time to take a photograph is when the sun is sort of not in a direct light of the object you're taking a picture of. So you want an overcast sky if possible too. These pictures were taken pretty much in the shade. So in other words, we don't have these harsh shadows that would normally appear on our image. And those can be a lot more to deal with once you start actually editing things. So it's best to have either an overcast sky, or at least taking something in the shadow and being able to have your camera at least pick up enough light. We're able to still pick up certain areas and different highlights. You can see we still have the reflection in the doorknob. We have a fairly bright blue sky, of course surrounded by buildings. And we could remove that if we want to, but what we're actually going to be doing is creating reflection maps and specularity maps for those a little bit later. But now we're going to go back and concentrate on fixing this blue haze in here. And there's a couple of ways we can do it. We could adjust our channels if we wanted to, but one thing we notice is that it's pretty much the same on all of our channels. You could, of course, in this case, take the blue, and it's a little bit darker, and we could always just correct that and then replace one of these with it. But that could throw off our color if that's going to be a problem. There's also other ways to do it, and I'm going to show you a pretty easy way involving just the selection tool and using feather. So what I'm going to do is just select our rectangular selection tool, start out in the gray area so that we start at right at the edges. I'm going to pull it up to about the top of where that blue ends and where the red sort of begins. And we also want to keep in mind the pixel size of our image. I'm going to take a look at our image size, and we can see our height's 904 pixels by 469. So we have to keep that in mind because we're going to be using the feather tool now. So if we right mouse click and we're going to go to feather, we can change our feather radius. And I'm going to change this up to 300 if it lets me. And it looks like we have to go up to 250, so I'm going to click OK. And that's one of the major issues with using feather for this technique, is that if your image is quite large, it might not work. But what we've done is actually created a sort of a gradient of 250 pixels up and down throughout this selection. So now what we can do is isolate that color and sort of remove it. And there's a couple of different tools we can use for that. We could use selective color, channel mixer. I'm going to go ahead and use the channel mixer for this. I'm going to grab our blue channel, and we can just reduce our blue. Of course, we don't want to reduce it too much, but we just want to match up with that color sort of at the center, and at least so it's not that as much of a gradient. And like I said before, we're actually working with sort of a gradient selection, so it is going to be more intense on the bottom than it is in the center, but we're subtly removing those certain effects, and you can really just kind of play around with that to find the correct color that you want, removing reds, adding reds if you need to, and just isolating whatever color you need to select. And of course we're just using our blue channel, so we're actually on our blue channel right here just editing that and not actually worrying about the overall color of the image. But we can see the difference where we start to get more of that natural color of the door back instead of that blue reflection from the concrete. So I'm going to click OK. And now we can do the same thing on the top, and just to kind of match up those colors. And those isn't really perfect right now. But you can mess with it as much as you want, just kind of playing around until you find the exact look you're going for. Go back to our channel mixer. We're going to be doing red this time. We'll reduce our red amount. And now we have an overall sort of grayish light blue. And it really depends on the actual color of the original image, if you know what that is. Click OK. And now if we take a look back how it looked before, I'm going to pull our layers down and just expand our history just a little. And we can take a look at the image before and then after, where we have a much more leveled out color, and we don't have any major changes, because you want to be using your 3D scenes to create certain lighting situations, and you don't want to have to rely on the image map or change the image map to match whatever it is you're creating in the scene. It's just much easier to have sort of that generic look to it. And then once we're at this point, we could even change, if we say that looks maybe too green, then we can just the overall color without having to mess with any sort of selection. And we could of course change that to any ridiculous color if we wanted to as well, but we can mess with this and get it to wherever we want. If we wanted to stick with that, we can just hit cancel, and I'm just going to keep that the way it is. I'm going to go back to our levels, Control L, and just kind of adjust that brightness again, and click OK. And that's basically our door texture. Of course I didn't really match up our top corner. If you can see that right there, it doesn't go all the way to the corner. It does on this side, but not this side. You can go back, change that if you want, or be a little more careful when you're playing around with it. I'm just doing it pretty roughly here, just to kind of give you an idea of the overall effect. We could also do the same thing if we notice it's a lot darker down here, not just the coloration, but the actual darkness of the image. I can go ahead and grab selection tool, and I'm going to feather that 250 once again, and this time I'm going to use layers, or levels, and I can just brighten it up if I want to, and that way we can remove the majority of that dark area down there. There's also filters that will help you with that. There's a lens correction filter for that as well. We'll get into that a little bit more later with the more complex texture. But now we basically have our door, and we can work on our other maps that are available for this, and we'll create a bump map, diffusion maps, reflection, and specularity. We're going to start out with the reflection map now, and I'm going to shorten the history back up and bring back our layers, because we're going to be working with multiple layers now. And I'm going to create a new layer above this one, and just zoom in, and I'm just going to use some of our shape tools. And what I want to do is make sure we have the white color selected as high as it'll go, so 255 on the RGB all the way down. And I'm going to create an ellipse. And I'll just be matching the shapes of these objects that we have that will have reflection. So I'll rasterize that layer. That should be fine. Now we'll go ahead and copy that down and move it. And then we can just match this by using free transform and just sort of dragging out the edges. And depending on how close, of course, you're going to be to that image depends on how precise you really need to be and whether or not you need to blur the edges. We're not really going to worry about that. I'll go ahead and minimize that so we can take a look at our hinges. And the hinges are going to be fairly simple. All we got to do is create a rectangle. So we're going to use the rectangle tool, and we'll just draw that out. And then we'll go to our layers panel and just rasterize that layer. Copy it, and use the move tool to move it down. And just fit that into our other hinge. And then just do that one more time. And get it to match up with the bottom. You can see there is a little bit of a darkness change. We could of course go back to the levels if we wanted to, but I'm just going to leave it the way it is for right now. So now we have the white areas defined, which are going to be our reflective areas. We could also go ahead and do that strip down there in the bottom if we wanted to make that just a little bit reflective. I'm more worried about sort of those the knobs and the hinges, which are the more obvious reflective items. And now what we want to do is just go ahead and select all of these shapes we just made, holding down shift, making sure the top layer is selected, go down to the bottom, hold down shift, select that layer, and we can hit Control E, which is going to merge down all of our layers. You can also reach that by going to Image, Adjustment, and Layer, and Merge Down. And now underneath that, what we want to do is create just a fill of black. So I'm going to create a new layer just on top of our color map that we got there, because we're still using that in the scene. And I'm just going to grab our paint bucket tool and with black lay that down. So now we have actually our reflection map. Very simple to create, but it'll make a very large impact on the actual scene when we're using that texture. Another thing we should probably do, which would be important, is blurring this out just a little, because these are very sharp objects, as we can see. So what we'll want to do is just add the tiniest bit of blur to them. So I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, and actually make sure that that shape layer is selected with all of our white areas. Blur, and we're going to select a Gaussian blur. And in this case, just that little subtle 0.6 pixel blur will be fine. And click OK. And just adds just that nice little bit of fuzz to the outside where it'll blend in better to that texture. And we can also use this as our specularity map. But first I'm going to hit Control E, which is going to merge down. So now we have a separate complete layer for our reflection map. But we can also use this as our specularity map. Of course, there is also that metal strip on the bottom, and you can just paint in or add in a box for that. So copy this layer, and we'll just add in that strip for the reflection map. Rectangle tool, white selected, and I'll just go ahead and draw that out. Of course, we can't see the whole thing right now, so I'll just move those out of the way. And I'm going to free transform And we'll check the other side. Looks okay. Hit enter. And now I'm just going to go in there and delete those areas just after we rasterize that layer. Bring down our opacity so that we can actually see what we're working with. And I'm going to bring that layer down just a little so we're right even on the top. And then we can use the eraser tool. And I'm going to right mouse click and of course bring down our diameter and then up our hardness to 100%. And we can just delete the areas we're not going to need. Okay, I'll go ahead and zoom out. And we'll make that next layer visible, the one underneath it. And I'm going to change our opacity so it's not quite perfectly white, because that's not going to have as much specularity as our knobs and our hinges, because it's an entirely different type of metal. It's more of a brushed metal. So bring it down to 50%, and then we can hit Control E to make that one complete layer. So now we have our color map, our reflection map, and our specularity map. And if you want to do that little tiny bit of reflection too, you could even use that specularity map as your reflection map. It doesn't really matter. You can always define that within whatever 3D program it is that you're using. Another thing you might want to consider is the bump map. Now the bump map, there's two different things we could do with it. We could either create an actual bump where we'll create some rectangles, white, along the trim, and then maybe a little bit on the hinges. But in this case, I would suggest just using this actual color map and then adjusting that to make it grayscale. And click OK, because this will give us just what we're looking for that bump, just those nice little details. And I suggest most of the time actually just using your color maps as your bump maps, just because there's so much more detail you can pull out of them, unless you're trying to be very, very specific about your bump maps. And a lot of the time, with certain textures you should be. But in cases like this, when you're using photos, you get a lot more detail by actually using the image maps themselves and not going in and creating something that looks like this, because that wouldn't really create the kind of effect that maybe you're going for. And we can also use this bump map once again as a diffusion map if you're going to be using a diffusion map, if you feel that's necessary for your texture. Otherwise, this texture is done. This also works, this technique, for windows, any other doors, things like that. And you could, of course, even make this seamless if you wanted to, at least horizontally seamless. If you wanted to have a bunch of doors in a row, all we'd really have to do is offset our texture. We'll just do a little bit of horizontal offset just to take a look at it. And all we really have to do then is just go in here with the clone stamp tool and remove that seam. And then if you wanted to, you could go ahead and make multiple copies of those doors. And as we can see now too, we have more distortion than it looked before. And this can also be a good reference to tell sort of the width overall, because this doesn't really match up, although it should. But that's just because we didn't do too much work with the actual transformation. But if we did want to change that, we obviously could just go in and select all those layers and free transform them again. So it's not really a big deal. You can always go back and change that.